Bible with were people who had been Christians before, but had really abandoned their faith in doing that. And there's one thing that really kind of was like the straw in the camel's back for me to really start thinking about this and wanting to write this stuff down. There's a couple, two friends of mine. They were married. Who I went to college with. The husband, while we were down in college, we'd actually go and preach at a bunch of different places that had need. Well, they decided to post on Facebook like a letter of resignation to their faith. They decided to write on Facebook, which would have amounted like pages and pages if it were handwritten, about why they are no longer Christians. And I read through the whole thing, and it was really difficult to read. But then I started looking at the comments, and things just got worse from there. And if you know what I'm talking about, anytime you go through the comment section of something, things almost always get worse from there. Because what I started seeing was other people who, in my mind, they were Christians as well, and yet they're applauding this couple for renouncing their faith. And I don't know, maybe I'm misunderstanding what it was they were saying or trying to say or something like that. But then there are other people who express the same doubts that they did. And it essentially express the same resignation of faith. That was a pretty disheartening thing to read. But as I started thinking about it, I can only imagine how sad God must have felt in that, because he saw the whole thing coming. He doesn't need a Facebook post to know how you're doing spiritually. Y'all know that? Well, all he has to do is look at the hearts of people. And I think at times that can be a really comforting thought. Well, God knows my heart. He knows what's in my heart. He knows truly what it is that I'm thinking and what it is that I'm feeling. But I'll tell you what, personally, sometimes I'm terrified by that. That God knows what is in my heart. He knows why I'm here this evening. And may it always be for good. Well, this evening, I want us all to be able to assess our faith. And I want to make clear, though, before we really jump into it, this is not going to be a sermon like on evidences or anything like that. Like, we're not going to be talking about why or the evidence for God being the creator. We're not going to be looking at evidences as to how Christ is our Savior, how he is true, how he is real, how we have evidence that this Bible that we're reading from is, in fact, the Word of God. All those things are good, but we're not going to be looking at those things in particular. I have two main goals here this evening. One, and perhaps foremost of all, is if you have serious doubts in your faith, in particular your faith in God, you need to talk to somebody about that. I want to make that clear right at the beginning. This is what I'm trying to accomplish, is to give you the confidence to actually be able to open up with somebody about these doubts that you're having in your faith. But secondly, if your faith is strong, then you need to talk to somebody about your faith. You need to create an environment in which one who doubts actually feels comfortable expressing those doubts to you. And we'll be talking about both of those things as we go. We'll make some other points, but I wanted to make those 2 points clear from the beginning. But really, before you can assess your faith, it's important to really define our terms and really establish what it is that we're talking about. We need to look at, well, what is faith? And I would imagine if this were like a Bible class setting and I just opened it up to the floor and I said, what Bible passage would you go to define faith? I'm going to guess y'all have on your minds Hebrews 11 and in verse 1, right? Hebrews 11 and verse 1. It says, now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Faith is the assurance of the foundation, that which holds up our hope. Right? That hope being the hope of salvation. So, since we're talking about salvation and things pertaining to salvation, this is some pretty important stuff that we're going to talk about this evening. We need to know that going into this, right? Without faith, we really have no foundation for hope to stand on. But faith also serves as the conviction or the evidence of things not seen. That's an interesting thought. I think people from a more skeptical mindset, perhaps a more worldly mindset, that kind of thinking when they come to the word faith, They think it's the opposite of evidence. Faith means there is zero evidence or anything like that. But in fact, the Hebrews writer seems to suggest that, well, faith is the evidence in some respect. We'll talk about that a little bit more. But I think we fool ourselves into thinking that we can address every single problem of doubt with some sort of academic pursuit of evidence. Now, it's going to help. Right? I think we should do that stuff from time to time, but we're not going to answer every single question because there are simply some things that are going to be unseen. And what we see is that faith is the evidence there. Now, in 1990, a musician that I'm a fan of, Paul Simon wrote a song called Proof. A song called Proof. Now, he's not addressing what we're talking about tonight at all, but in that song, he has a line that I was always intrigued about. He says, faith is an island in the setting sun, but proof is the bottom line for everyone. Now, my issue with this line is that it implies that these two things are mutually exclusive. Meaning, if you have proof of something, then you really have no need for faith. And if you have faith, well, that means you really had no proof for something. Like these two things are opposites from one another. And I don't think that's necessarily the case. However, I do get what his sentiment is. I think Paul Simon is expressing a desire that all of us have. Anytime you're making some pretty big decisions, you want proof that this is going to be a good decision in whatever it is that we're trying to do. I remember presenting this lesson to some high school kids, and they're really talking about these things. Many of them, juniors and seniors, trying to figure out what they're going to do following high school, whether they should go to school, whether they should go to trade school, whether they should go to college, and if so, which one, stuff like that. Like, man, wouldn't it be nice if you just knew beyond the shadow of a doubt this was the right decision, this was the place to go, right? Proof is wonderful. We would love that kind of thing, but is that really even possible in every situation or any situation? Hebrews 11 and verse 6 says that without faith, it is impossible to please God. And that's certainly true, but I would argue even further that without faith, it's impossible to even please yourself. I don't think we can go a day without acting upon faith in some regard. We cannot live without faith. Now, the context of the song that I mentioned before is that a couple is about to get married. And the narrator wants proof that everything's going to go well. And his argument seems to be, well, you can't just jump into marriage on faith. You have to go into it knowing that, this is the person, and I know it because of this, and this, and all that stuff. Now, I've been married for 13 years now. I'm going to guess some of you in the audience have been married a little bit longer. Y'all know this. Yes, you went into that marriage. I went into my marriage feeling pretty confident that this was the woman that I was going to spend the rest of my life with. If I didn't have that confidence, I wasn't going to take that plunge. There was a certain level of confidence. And I had evidence that my wife, Hannah, was going to be faithful to me. I could look at certain things, but you know, as I do, that ultimately we said I do in faith. We didn't know everything that was going to happen. We didn't know everything, how she was going to respond in those early years of marriage or something like that, how I was going to respond when kids started showing up and all that. Like, how are we going to react to that? We didn't know, but there's a certain level of faith that we act upon. Now, that's a big level of faith, but I think even on smaller measures, we still act upon faith. You all drove to the building here, right? You drove on the right side of those yellow lines, I would hope, right? And you did so in faith that the people on the other side of those lines were going to do the same thing, right? You parked your car in the parking lot, right? You're doing so in faith that when you step out these doors in a few minutes, that your car's still going to be there, right? Those of you with kids, if you're taking them to school, you take them to school in faith that, well, they're going to be there when you come to pick them up or the bus or whatever like that, right? Like we are acting upon faith every single day. We cannot please ourselves if we are not acting upon some form of faith. Everybody acts upon faith. But I want to consider also Ecclesiastes chapter 9. Go ahead and turn there. Look at Ecclesiastes chapter 9. Now, the writer of Ecclesiastes, he makes a habit of saying, like, I've observed this thing to be true, but then again, I've also observed this, and that kind of counteracts that and stuff like that, and he kind of goes back and forth. But there's one thing that he says with a good bit of confidence. Ecclesiastes chapter 9, beginning in verses 11, he says, I again saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift, the battle is not to the warriors, and neither is bread to the wise, nor wealth to the discerning, nor favor to men of ability. For time and chance overtake them all. Moreover, a man does not know his time. Like fish caught in a treacherous net, and birds trapped in a snare, so the sons of men are ensnared at an evil time when it suddenly falls on them. What he's expressing here is like we simply don't know what's going to happen next. Time and chance happens to everyone. If we're going to try and only act upon proof every single moment of the day, we're going to be left with nothing. Because there's going to come a time when we have to act upon some form of faith. Now, what I want to do for the rest of the lesson this evening is really to assess where our faith is, particularly our faith in God. Because I feel as though every single one of us has a faith that fits on like a spectrum of sorts. It's not like you either have it or you don't. I think it fits more along the lines of a spectrum, where on one end you have doubts, right? Life-altering doubts, we can put it that way, in such a way as where you now have these doubts that are going to change the way you live your life now. It is now changing your everyday life. You're not going to behave in the same way you did before. But then on the other end, we have faith that makes you well, if I can use the words of Jesus there. And I think the truth is that we sometimes move up and down that spectrum, depending on what's going on in our lives. Maybe for some of us, it's year to year. We're kind of moving along those lines, month to month. Maybe there's stuff going on in your life that's so difficult right now that you feel like day to day you're being whipped along that spectrum, not really sure where you're going to be. I'm reminded, though, of an important passage concerning faith. Look at Mark chapter 9. Mark chapter 9. This has been a humbling passage for me and certainly a helpful one when I feel as though I'm struggling in my faith to some degree. In this passage, there's a man who has a son, and that son has a demon. And this man desperately wants this demon out of his son. And so he goes to the disciples, but they're unable to cast out that demon. And so the disciples then discuss this incident with Jesus. And after the Father explains the situation to Jesus, he says, if you can do anything, take pity on us. Help us. Look what Jesus says in verse 23. If you can, all things are possible to him who believes. So this man is a son who is demon-possessed. He comes to Jesus asking for help. If you can do anything. And Jesus says, if you can, all things are possible to him who believes. So essentially, the health of this man's son is completely contingent on his faith, on how much he believes. I don't know, that's a troubling thing for me personally. Like, I brought my son with me this evening. If he was in a desperate situation, I mean really dire situation where his life was on the line, but his salvation, him being saved and being here with us, depended on how much faith I had, that's a difficult thought. That the health of my son depends upon my faith. But that's essentially what Jesus is saying. He says, I can do it. Do you believe that I can do it? I love what the man says here in verse 24. He says, I do believe, but help my unbelief. Folks, there's going to be times when we know we believe, but for whatever reason, the dots just aren't connecting, maybe like they used to, or like they did even yesterday. The prayer that needs to be on our lips is, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. And look what Jesus does in response. Does Jesus look at him and say, well, tough, come back to me when you have full belief, then maybe we can do something about your son? No, he heals him. He takes care of him right then. Jesus is looking for faith on our parts, but we must come to him asking for more. I believe we all have doubts to varying degrees, but we all have doubts. Our constant prayer needs to be, help my unbelief. And so first, I want to address those of us who are in the life-altering doubt situations. And for those listening online, if this appeals to you, if this defines you, pay special attention to this part. And we're going to spend the majority of our time on that. But in the last few minutes, we'll take a look at faith that makes you well as well. Those of us who have faith that makes us well, what we need to do in that as well. So first, if you're struggling in your faith, if you have this life-altering doubt, there's some things that I think we need to do first. There's some things I would encourage you to do. 3 things in particular. And first is to figure out specifically what it is your doubts are. What are you doubting? Earlier I referenced Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 6. It's interesting that the rest of that verse, Hebrews 11 and verse 6, says that without faith it is impossible to please him. Then the rest of the verse reads, for he who comes to God must believe. Believe, the same word for faith there, right? He must have faith. But look at the 2 things that he's said that he needs to believe. First, that he is. I think that's a reference that just the fact that God exists, right? And then secondly, that he is a rewarder of those who seek him. I think you can boil that down to that God is good. For those who have doubts, I think generally speaking, at least in my experience in talking with people, it fits in one of these 2 categories. Does God actually exist? And if he does, is he good? Can you explain that to me in some way, shape, or form? But it's important that we establish specifically what our doubts are. Does it have more to do with the existence? Does it have more to do with the fact if God is good or not? Does it have to do with the existence of the Bible, if it's really the Word of God or not? Or maybe just does God exist? And if he does he actually care about me? Is he actually involved in our lives? What we need to do is figure out what our doubt is. We need to be as specific as we can. And I would highly encourage, write it down even. If you got a little journal, notes on your phone or something like that, write down what it is that you're doubting and be as specific as you can. But secondly, you got to figure out what kind of doubt it is that's troubling you. Is it a logical thing, like an evidence-based thing? Is there really enough proof to believe in God? Or is it more of an emotional doubt? I just don't feel the way other Christians seem to feel. Or I don't feel the way I used to, right? I've read that passage 100 times before, and it just doesn't hit me the same way. Or I've sung these songs before. Faith is the victory. But that just doesn't do it for me anymore. Or maybe it's a little of both. I think typically that would explain it. But lastly, when we write down what these doubts are, we figure out what kind of doubt it is, we also need to figure out, where are these doubts coming from? We need to assess how did they even come about? Do you have these doubts because you came across some conflicting evidence? You found out about some billion-year-old fossil that's troubling you or something like that? Or maybe some crafty, YouTube philosopher. You heard some video or some guy challenged you at work or something like that, and you didn't know how to respond to it. And so you've been kind of challenged in that way. If that's the case, write it down. There's no need to be ashamed of that just yet. I think these are things we just need to start thinking through. Write it down. Or were your doubts created when you went through something really difficult? And I think that's new evidence. You thought life was going to be like this, but then this happened. You thought you had all the proof in the world that your spouse would be faithful to you, but then, this happened over here. Or you had all the proof in the world that this church was going to be good to me, but then this thing happened over here. And then maybe you've gone through something traumatic, difficult. Or someone you know has gone through something difficult. And that has caused some doubts in your life. Again, write it down. Make it known. Make it real in your head by writing these things down. Or maybe, and be honest with yourself, do your doubts stem really from peer pressure? Like, it's not necessarily that there's evidence on the outside that's like pulling you out of the faith. It's not that you found like some sort of evidence, but it's like people who are kind of pulling you out of the faith or something like that. I don't know, maybe friends from work, friends from school, or something like that. It's just kind of caused you to be embarrassed over some of the things that you believe and do and things like that. Or maybe you've been treated poorly by people. And that's not necessarily new evidence about the existence of God or the goodness of God, but it certainly makes you question the goodness of his people. And so it's not necessarily you being pulled out of the faith, but now it's more you're being pushed out of the faith. Maybe that's something that's going on. Or maybe your doubts really just come from, I just want to live differently. I don't really feel like doing these things anymore. And this new way of life is more the way I'd like to go. Again, be specific. Write these things down. Be humble about this approach. But once you've established what your doubts are and where they come from, you really need to address those doubts. You need to address them. To look at something else at Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 6, we see that faith in God is established through seeking him. He is a rewarder of those who seek him. I've studied with some people, as I mentioned at the beginning, who have had some struggles in their faith. And they'll come to me and they'll just say, like, look, Dustin, I don't know. I'm really struggling with whatever this idea is. I'm struggling with this. I'll ask the questions. All right, so what have you done? Like, how have you approached this topic? What kind of research have you gone through? Who have you talked to? He's like, well, no, it's just kind of been in my head. I'm just struggling. You can't call it a struggle if you're not actually struggling with this thing, like working with it, wrestling with this idea. You need to be working through this. If this is truly a doubt in your faith, again, we talked about at the beginning, faith has to do with salvation. It's impossible to please God without faith. If we're seeing it in those severe lights, then how can we continue to say that we're struggling with something, but we're not actually struggling and working with it? So you need to talk to somebody about these things. Consider John the Baptist. This story is found in Matthew chapter 11 as well as Luke chapter 7. But John the Baptist, man, first of all, I think that's a crazy thing that John the Baptist had doubts. He had doubts as to whether Jesus really was the one that they should be hoping for, or should they look for someone else. But in those doubts, what did John the Baptist do? He's sitting in a prison. Did he just kind of twiddle his thumbs and say, well, I guess I'll never know? No, he talked to somebody. Or rather, he got some of his disciples to go talk to Jesus. In those doubts, he worked through them. He tried to figure these things out. When you doubt, you need to do some research. You need to actually start looking for answers. Think about the Bereans in Acts chapter 17. Famously, it said of the Bereans that they diligently searched the scriptures. You understand, like, when Paul's bringing up all these things in the synagogue, he's talking about the Christ. It's not like they were unaware of the Christ, the Messiah. They knew about the Messiah. That's in the old scriptures. They know all about that. But what Paul is saying is that Jesus is the Messiah. And then he died, but was resurrected. Those things may not have been quite so obvious from the scriptures. And the Bereans were not ready just to say, all right, Paul, that sounds good. No, they wanted to search the scriptures a little while. They had some doubts. Paul, is this really true, what it is that you're saying? But they didn't just sit in those doubts. They researched these things. They searched the scriptures for answers. If someone is going to say and provide maybe some evidence that God is not truly the creator of the world, all right, consider the evidence, but look at all the evidence. If someone's going to say that this doctrinal practice or something like that isn't really what you should be doing, you ought to be doing this, all right, then search the scriptures that they provide and things like that. Be willing to search these things that might be causing us some doubt. But as you talk and as you search, be sure that you're doing it sincerely. There's an interesting story in Luke chapter 1 with Zacharias, the priest, and Mary, the young virgin. Both are told some rather unbelievable stuff. Right? Zacharias, you're going to have a child even though you're pretty old. And Mary, you're going to have a child even though you're a virgin. They both get some pretty crazy information. And interestingly enough, they both have the same response. They both say, how can this be? However, Zacharias is punished for asking that question. He's made mute. While Mary is actually praised because it says that she believed. It says that Mary actually believed what was told her. Within the text, I think there's reason to doubt the sincerity of Zacharias in his question of how can this be? For one, the angel points out in his response that Zacharias did not believe, but also, think about it, Zacharias, the priest, by the way, did he have any evidence that God is able to make an elderly person have a child? You don't think of any stories in the Bible that might talk about something like that? Yeah, he knows about that. He knows about these stories, and yet his instinctual response, how can that be? That can't happen. And so he's made mute as a result of that. It seems clear that he asks this question, how can this be? But it was really more a statement of a lack of faith. If he asks it, it's not sincerely. So are you asking these questions because you actually want answers? Or are these questions really just statements of doubt? So I started preaching full-time about 3.5 years ago or so. Before that, I was a middle school English teacher. I taught middle school English. The age-old question, really for all kids, but particularly middle schoolers who are rather moody, is, Mr. Merkel, why do we have to do homework? What is the point of homework? We shouldn't have to do that. Well, in the first couple of years that I was teaching, I remember thinking, all right, I'm going to have the perfect answer for them. And so I stayed up all night figuring out, this is, here's the reason it does this, does this, does this. I'm going to lay it all out there for them. And then the next time some punk kid asks me that question, I'm going to hit them with this answer, and they're not going to know what to do with it. And so they did it. I gave them my answer, felt really good about it, and their response was, yeah, but why do we have to do homework? They didn't care. They didn't care about what I was going to say because they weren't asking sincerely. No, their question, why do we have to do homework, wasn't searching for an answer. It was just a statement of, I hate homework and I don't want to do it. When we have statements of doubt, or questions of doubt, I should say, are they really just statements rather than questions? Because if that's the case, we need to alter where we're starting. Again, one of my goals is if you have doubts, no matter where you are on that spectrum, if you have doubts, you need to talk to someone about those doubts, address them. But maybe you need to have a conversation with yourself first. And ask yourself, is this something I really want to find an answer to? Or am I really just making a statement as opposed to asking a question? But finally, after we do all these things, we write down what our doubts are, we address those doubts. We need to be humble enough to change accordingly, if need be. We need to change accordingly. And this, of course, is the most difficult part of it. We need to come to God, as it says. Without faith, it is impossible to please him, for he who comes to God. We need to be willing to come to him. But again, this is difficult. Because sometimes when we have doubts and we find answers to those doubts, then it does demand a change. A proper response to truth does demand a change. We'd like to think that it's just as easy as the scientific method, right? And sure, there are certainly aspects of the scientific method here where we're stating a problem, we're trying to fix something, we're having a hypothesis, we're finding answers, finding clues, and all these things. We do the next step, and so that would mean that whatever the next step is, that'd be easy, right? And I think some people say that. Some people say, like, well, if they just answer this, this, and this, then finally, all right, fine, I'll do it. I don't know. It's hardly ever that easy. It's hardly ever that easy. The truth is, at least, again, personally speaking, the majority of people I've interacted with, it was never, is there enough evidence to merit change? The problem really came down to is, do I want to change? Do I actually want to change? And please believe me, I don't want to offend anyone right now who is having doubts in their faith. Trying to make it seem like it's some sort of trite, trivial thing that you just want to do whatever it is that you want to do or something like that. But we need to ask ourselves, are we actually willing to change if that's demanded? Because faith is more a matter of will than it is some sort of academic exercise. By the end of John chapter 6, it's an interesting story here. In John chapter 6, you'll remember Jesus feeds 5,000 people, right? And he does so with very little food. He feeds all of these people, and these people are excited. They go over to Jesus, and Jesus starts talking to them. What's interesting is that after Jesus starts talking to them, they withdraw from Jesus. They don't want to follow him anymore. Was it because there wasn't enough evidence that he was the Christ? No, they had just eaten the evidence. They know it. And yet they still ask in John chapter 6, what then do you do for a sign so that we may see and believe? Is it a sign that they really needed? Is that what it was going to take for them to actually begin to follow Jesus? No, they got their sign, but they chose not to believe it. Consider the rich young ruler. We're going to look at him a good bit tomorrow night. For just a minute, though, consider him. He comes to Jesus. He recognizes Jesus as a good teacher. He kneels before him. He shows him honor and respect. And he asks Jesus, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus gives him an answer. But it's not the answer that he wanted. But I thought he was a good teacher. And I thought a good student listens to a good teacher. No, he chose not to have faith and follow him. And it made him sad to do this. His will trumped the truth that he received from Jesus. And I'll just say this as an aside. I remember one guy I was studying with in particular who was a Christian and fell away, and I was talking with him. He said, Dustin, I want you to know that this was not an easy decision to walk away from Jesus. He said, and I'll never forget this, he said, not all of us walk away skipping and jumping. I think, and this is, I'll speak personally, I kind of always thought those who do walk away from Jesus really were just doing it because it made them the most happy or something like that. This was going to be the most fulfilling thing in their life. And maybe there's something in their mind that does think that. But I was humbled in this conversation. He did so. He walked away, but he wasn't happy about it. In fact, he was really sad. He said he reached a pretty terrible point of depression after walking away. Now, I will say that same person has since come back, and praise God for that. And he's a wonderful contribution to the church back in Georgia, and it's a wonderful thing. But he was extremely sad, much like this rich young ruler. He walked away sorrowfully. But consider also the aptly named Doubting Thomas in John chapter 20. You remember him? Thomas announces his doubt for everyone, right? He did just what we were talking about. Write down your doubt. Know what it is, right? And he says it. He says it's very clear what his doubt is. I will not believe unless I do all these things, right? I'm going to touch holes in his hand where his side was pierced and all of that. But to Thomas's credit, Jesus is pretty critical of him, but to Thomas's credit, when he demands that he sees his hands and his feet and touch his side, what does Thomas do? He declares, my Lord and my God. Thomas changes. He needed evidence. And sometimes we're at a point where we need some form of evidence. But be like Thomas, that when you get that evidence, that you do something about it. And you change accordingly, just like Thomas did. I want to kind of illustrate these, what I've been talking about a little bit, which is two short stories that we find in these accounts. First, in John chapter 10, we read about the Pharisees. And the Pharisees would really be an example of what not to do in this situation, an example of people who are doubting. And they've been doubting for really quite some time, but there's some debate within these group of Pharisees. John chapter 7 and John chapter 10 tell us that they were debating, is he the Christ? Is he not? Is he a good man? Is he not? And they're going back and forth with all this. But John 8 indicates that some of them believed, but others kind of returned to this state of doubt. So, in John chapter 10 and verse 24, they make clear what their doubt is to Jesus. And they say to Jesus, "Are you the Christ?" So, they state what their doubt is, and to their credit, they actually address that doubt. They go to Jesus specifically. Jesus is the source, and they ask him, "How long will you keep us in suspense? If you are the Christ, tell us plainly." Seems pretty clear, though, in that context. They're not super sincere about this question of Jesus. They're not really looking for an answer. They've already ignored evidence. It seems as though, at best, they're trying to appease something that Nicodemus had said, like, hey, if we're going to put someone on trial, we should probably go to the source first. Maybe that's what they're trying to do. Maybe they're just trying to appease what Nicodemus said. I think it's more that they're trying to trap Jesus and eventually get him killed. I don't think they ask this question very sincerely. And so do the Pharisees change? Well, of course not. Mostly because they had no intent on changing from the beginning. Now, if the Pharisees serve as a negative example, I think Peter serves as a good example. Now, I know Peter is also an example of doubt on many occasions in his life. But I love what Peter does at the end of Jesus' life in Luke chapter 24. You remember, earlier in Luke 23, Jesus is killed. But in Luke 24, a group of women go to Jesus' tomb and they find it empty. And they're confused. They're distressed. They don't know what to do. Until these two angels appear. And they tell them that he is risen, just as he said he would. And the women are excited. They run over to the apostles. They tell them what happened. Do you remember how the apostles respond? Luke 24 and verse 11 points out that it was utter nonsense to them. That's how the New American Standard reads. They didn't believe him. They had doubts. But what does Peter do in those doubts? Well, Peter lays out pretty specifically what his doubt is. He says, has Jesus risen from the dead? He asks that question in Luke 24. Well, what did Peter do in that doubt? I love this. In verse 12, it says that he runs to the tomb. Peter runs to the tomb. If only we saw our doubts as pressing as Peter saw his. That he dropped everything he was doing to run to the tomb. I mean, this ought to serve as like a metaphor of sorts in our lives, that when we are doubting, when we are struggling with something, run to the tomb. If you want more evidence as to whether God is real or not, run to the tomb. Go find evidence for those things. Stop twiddling your thumbs. Do something about it. See how serious this situation is. Peter runs to the tomb. And when he got his answer, when he saw the empty tomb, Peter changed. In John's account, we're told that he didn't really understand everything that was going on, but he understood enough to act differently. And when you go through the book of Acts, you see a totally different Peter. You see such a wonderful change in Peter's life. He had seen the risen Lord. He saw the empty tomb, and he acted. He changed his life because of it. They were fearless and they were bold because those doubts had been addressed. Now, I know it's true that our doubts might not be met with the same amount of sight and certainty that it was for the apostles. But if you go back to John 20, Jesus calls those who did not see and yet still believe He calls them blessed. He praises those who act in that way. He makes clear that faith or belief is possible even without sight. We read that in Hebrews chapter 11 earlier, but Paul affirms this as well in 2 Corinthians 5, that we walk by faith, not by sight. Lastly, and I promise quickly, I want to look at if we have strong faith that makes us well, what is it that we should do? Well, we ought to continue seeking God. Remember, Hebrews 11 and verse 6 says that God is a rewarder of those who seek Him. We must constantly try to understand Him better, constantly be seeking His Word, even if we are not doubting. I'm reminded of a story of Peter walking on the water in Matthew chapter 14. I just had Peter as a good sign of faith. Here's one of these bad examples of faith from Peter. He had faith at this time. He's heard Jesus teach. He's seen Jesus do miracles. He's even seen Jesus walk on the water. And so he acts upon that evidence, and he begins walking on the water himself. But then he sinks. He starts to sink. Why? He took his eyes off of Jesus. He saw the wind, or he felt the winds, and he saw the waves, and he took his eyes off of Jesus. He was frightened. We need to continue to seek Jesus, to continue to seek the gospel, His word, and implement that in our lives and continue to seek God. We also must be willing to share our faith, especially with those who are doubting. We need to tell others why we believe. I think there's more to this verse than what I'm about to say, 1 Peter 3 and verse 15, but I know it does mean this as well. To sanctify Christ as Lord in your hearts, always being ready to make a defense to everyone who asks you to give an account for the hope that is in you, yet with gentleness and reverence. We must be willing to defend our faith. But again, especially to those who are doubting. When I say defend, I really mean share. Express our faith through our actions. I think that's really what the verse is hinting at. But also in our words. It says an account for the hope that is in you. What is the assurance or foundation of hope? Well, we read it earlier. It's faith. We need to be willing to share our faith. And certainly we need to be willing to share our faith with people who've never read the Bible before or maybe have once or twice or something like that. You know, we also need to be willing to share our faith with that 40-year-old who's been sitting in the same spot in the pew for years and years and years, who just is maybe struggling with some stuff, is maybe doubting. And maybe you think to yourself, well, he should know better. Yeah, maybe. Nonetheless, are we willing to share our faith with the one who is struggling? In particular, are we able to do it in gentleness and reverence? Thirdly, we must create a safe place for change, a good environment for change. Essentially, we can't ridicule or shame people who are having doubts, even if it's something that you don't struggle with at all. We cannot shame people for having doubts. You can say what you want about my generation and the generations that come after me. You can say we're soft, we're fragile, and really all that's probably true. But I can assure you, you're not going to get anywhere with my generation or the generations afterwards if you shame them into belief. It's not going to happen. And really, I think it works for all generations. That's not how we share the faith with other people. No, we create an environment in which they can share these doubts, but they can have confidence that they're going to be met with answers, or at least met with someone who's willing to go search for the answers with them and study these things with them. Like, hey, look, I don't know. I don't have the answers right here, but would you mind getting together maybe once a week and talking about these things? I'd love to do it. Let's go get some coffee sometime. Let's go get some pancakes. I don't know. Let's talk about these things, right? This is something that we got to address in the church. But I think for sure in the family, perhaps most particularly with fathers. Deuteronomy chapter 6 has a whole lot to say about passing on the torch to the next generation, but you know who it's speaking to? It's speaking to fathers. Fathers, we got to step up. And we got to be sharing our faith with our children, but creating an environment in which they can ask questions. And if you just haven't persuaded them or something like that, that they can say that. And you can have that kind of back and forth. We need to be able to do it without shame or embarrassment, even when it does kind of shame us or embarrass us a little bit. But we're willing to take the time and field those questions. We've talked about a lot of things this evening. But I hope everyone here today who has doubts has at least been built up a little bit. And they can share those doubts with someone that they know, and they love, and they trust. If you want to do that publicly, we have a tradition of offering an invitation. Now, typically that invitation is if you're ready to become a Christian or you have to confess something or something like that. Hey, confessing a doubt is something that could be made, that could be done here tonight. And I think that would be a step in the right direction to try and figuring these things out. If that describes you, I hope you would consider that more. But maybe you're past doubts. You're convinced. Look, I know I need to make this change in my life, and I'm going to do it. This is the time that I'm going to do it. Maybe that change is that you need to be baptized. You're ready to make that change and have your sins forgiven. We can make that happen. I don't know how quickly it can be done. Oak Mountain, it takes like 45 minutes to fill up that pool. But we can do that. We can wait. That'd be a good thing to do. If you have any need